Hello and welcome back to Genesis Designs and Modelcraft, and welcome back to Modelling for Beginners, and this is part 3 of this Mosquito PR16 build. So you may recall, if you've been watching the series, that we left it last time with that basic interior paint completed and a little layer of X22 clear over all the parts. Now what I've done in the intervening moments is I've done a little bit of detail painting, and not a lot, and the reason I didn't do it on camera is because of the time it would take. If I'm not careful, this will end up being a artwork of magnificent proportions, much like those magazines where you buy the first issue for 99p and subsequent issues cost £6 and there are 250 episodes. Anyway, I digress as usual. Yes, I painted the parts off camera. Now to paint the parts I have used, if you want to copy along exactly, this is Vallejo Model Air. BS Verde Oscuro, but essentially this is purporting to be Royal Air Force Dark Green. I've used that to paint the seat cushions. So the seat cushions on most World War II era aircraft, and indeed the boot around the base of the control column, were leather. So one might be tempted to paint them brown, but in fact the overwhelming majority of them were green, in RAF aircraft at least, as the other seat cushion. So I've just painted those with a brush. The brush I used on this occasion is this one. It is an Ammo 20, which so far has still got a reasonable point on it. So I just decant a little bit of paint into my palette here. Here it is. And I suppose normally you wouldn't brush paint Vallejo Model Air, but the thing is, with brush painting small detail areas, you do need the paint to be quite thin. So if you were going to use model colour, you'd end up thinning it anyway. So model area is fine. You will find that a few coats are necessary, so just take your time and pop that on there. Try and be neat, obviously, but it's not the end of the world if you're not super duper neat, because for one thing the wash will neaten things up for us a little bit. And for another, because that X22 surface is there, if you do make a little slip, say you're going around the seat cushion and you make a little slip and you've got a bit of dark green, if you get a clean wooden cocktail stick, you can just gently rub the offending spot away, because the X22 is going to reject it to an extent. If it doesn't immediately rub away with the stick, just moisten it slightly and give it another rub, and you can get rid of it, no harm done. I've also picked out a few odds and sods using black inside there. That's just standard XF85 rubber black, and this is a sort of pretty much a pre-thinned mix in this jar, so I simply shake up the jar, and then when I take the lid off, that little bit of paint in the lid there is good to go. If you're painting for a long time, every now and again, periodically, what you'll need to do is pop the lid back on, reshake it up to get a fresh layer of thin paint in the lid, because obviously it will gradually gas off and get thicker as the painting proceeds. And as well as that, you might need to clean the brush occasionally. So that leaves us in a position where we're ready to put the wash onto these parts. So the reason we use a wash is to help to delineate this detail, to help to make it sort of pop out of the surface, so to say, make it more visible in essence. Some people like to think of it as weathering, but what we're actually doing is just accentuating the shadows around all of this detail. They're already there if you look closely, but especially once it's all together and the canopy's on, it becomes much harder to see. So we use a wash, a dark colour, just to make that detail stand out a bit more. There are many types of wash. Maybe I'll do a wash episode at some other point, detailing some of those types, but for now we're just going to, suffice to say, we're going to use this Ammo of MIG. Now this one's called Streaking Effects. Not worry too much about what it says on the bottle, because essentially what's inside is the same in all cases, it just varies in viscosity. This is a slightly thicker mix. The panel liners are slightly thinner, and the ones aimed at armour models are slightly thicker than this. But I've chosen this because, as you can see, it's a nondescript sort of dirty dark colour, but it has a distinct green hue to it. Quite often you'll go with one that's got more of a brown sort of look to it, but this green is going to work well with our base colour. So you need to give these a good mix. If you use it regularly, then shaking will suffice, but over time the pigment will settle down to the bottom and it will need to be reincorporated by stirring rather than just shaking. So I take that lid out. Good test to do with these type of washes, because these are enamel based. Use whatever, this is a Tamiya stirring stick, dip it in and make sure that everything's in suspension still. If I just get the excess off here. If you look towards the top edge of that stick, you can see some slight dots maybe. You will get this with these washes, particularly if they're a little bit older. Once they get to the point where you have a collection of dots and a load of clear thinners, just throw it away, because at that point the pigment paint has come out of suspension, come out of solution, and they're actually just absolutely no use to anybody. So just throw it away. Thankfully this one isn't there yet, so we're going to use it. But as it is in the jar, this is too thick for what we want. So if I get a dodgy old brush, get some and stick it in here. There we go. It's not thick by any means, as you can see, but it's too thick for what I want to do with this, especially with the parts being so small, because it's just too dark. So I'm going to thin it down a little, and for that you need enamel thinners. A couple of drops of that. Give it a mix. And again, if this was starting to come out of solution, you'd really see it now. You just see an awful lot of big lumps and mess. I'll reiterate, when it gets like that, just throw it away, it's pointless. Just make a mess of everything. So, application. I thinned that down, that's probably about half as thick as it was. There's no ratios with that. Do experiments, find out what works for you and how you like to use it. I've loaded up a brush, it's a reasonably decent brush. I'm going to try and keep myself in shot and just touch the brush to the edges and the bits you want to highlight, like that. There are lots of washes out there, there are lots of various people using them, different videos, and a lot of people will just sort of slather the whole thing in wash. That's perfectly fine if that's what you want to do, but to be honest, all that achieves is a lot of cleanup. Ultimately we only want the wash to stay in the corners and the edges of things, so that's the only place I'm putting it. There we go. And just go around all the parts, applying the wash into the corners of things. And that, let the capillary action, just, you can see here quite nicely how that's finding the edge, and it's just running around there quite happily. Leaving us with quite minimal cleanup to do. And that's that added. So if I bring that up closer, you can see straight away, before I even clean it up, you can see how that detail is far more obvious all of a sudden. And now what we have to do is wait for this to dry. Being enamel wash, the drying time is a little bit longer than with some. The sort of flory style chalk type washes dry quite quickly. Oil washes will take even longer than this, but it's quite critical that it's allowed to dry. But whilst it does want to be dry before we start to manipulate it, we don't want it to be completely dry. So if I went away and left this overnight, say, that would be bad, because the wash will actually stain the underlying paint very slightly if it's allowed to fully dry. Sometimes that's not really an issue because it looks a little bit like shading in some cases, but you need to learn to catch it just at the right stage so it appears dry. When you look at it, you're not seeing the gloss, but it's not fully dry. So maybe, let's say maybe half an hour, something like that, this needs to be left and allowed to dry out, and then we'll go around and clean everything up. Once the wash is dry enough, if I come close, you can see there's no longer any sort of wetness about that appearance there. Then we can start to remove it. As with everything, there are multiple ways of removing it. And the method you use depends upon the effect that you want to get and the positioning of the part. So with easy things like this floor detail, you can just use a cotton bud. This is dry, there's nothing on it, and I'm just going to gently buff across the area, and notice I'm buffing into the relief so as not to remove all of the wash. I'll just take away those kind of dots where I flowed the wash into the line. That's all I need to do, because I applied it neatly in the first place. The cleanup is just as easy as that. Now obviously, given the size of the cotton bud and the size of the part, the cotton bud isn't always the best or easiest thing to use for removal. And if your parts are not sufficiently dry, if the wash isn't sufficiently dry, the cotton bud will tend to pretty much just take most of it off, to be honest. Okay, so the other method is to use a paintbrush. Now what I've done here, I have a little bit of enamel thinners in there, in this recess, and I dampen the brush in the thinners, and then I remove most of it on this clean paper towel. Then take your brush, which is just moistened with thinner, and essentially clean up around the part. I'm using a very fine brush. You need to use a brush with a point on it. It's really important that the brush is sufficiently good quality or has a sufficiently good point to be able to be very precisely directed. And I just nip round and remove those little bits of excess. You will find that you need to re-moisten the brush quite frequently because there really isn't very much thinners on it. But you literally, the brush doesn't want to be wet to the point of thinners is being put onto the surface. It needs to be wet enough to pick up the wash that we don't want, and dry enough so that it doesn't really move the rest of it. I don't know if I can really do this in mid-air well enough to be able to see. I need to develop the skills of a surgeon whereby I can work by looking up at the camera screen instead of the part. But you see how I'm just there. Went along that edge, that cluster of wires or whatever they're supposed to be, and just picked up all of that excess wash. Clean and re-moisten the brush, dry it off again, drag it gently along the top of that detail to pick up the wash off the top. You still see what I'm doing as you can. The other benefit of doing it this way, that more specifically when working on the outside of the model, is that these little sort of morsels of excess wash that we pick up can be dragged around, moved around, and used to create lovely little subtle streaks and stains. Very, very in scale, sort of dirty marks. As you can see, my hand bridge is being used to great effect on this. Let me just get in between these parts here. This is why you need a brush that comes to a good point. And you also need to hold your breath. Now, as you can possibly see, as you're probably figuring out for yourselves, this is not a fast process, and with the dryness of the parts of the wash being such an issue, i.e. that you don't want it to get too dry to do this, a big piece of advice with this, when doing the outside of a model in particular, is do it in sections. Don't put wash across the entire surface of the model and then start doing this, because you'll end up getting to a point where a lot of the wash is just too dry and you won't be able to get it off properly. This is enamel wash. It can be regarded as semi-permanent. Once it's completely dry, it's really quite difficult to remove. Okay. For those who are even less patient than I am, you can speed this all up using a hairdryer. Just apply the wash as normal and then use a hairdryer just to speed up the drying of the wash. But again, just do a small area at a time. Alright, now that's got most of it off. And look how much more visible. Oh, I've just broke my control wheel. Damn it. I'll glue that back in a second. Look how much more visible that detail is already. So the next thing you need to do is actually to leave that to dry again, because everything's just been moistened with that thinners, enamel thinners. Just let that dry off a touch. Oh, I'm making a mess of this now. These things happen. So just set that aside, let it dry for another sort of several minutes, work on a different part. Alright then, once the sort of excess thinners and what have you has evaporated back off again, the final touch that I always do is just take a cotton bud and ever so gently just tickle it across the top of everything, and it'll just pick up any little stray untidy bits to give a nice neat finished wash. Just like so. Now obviously the neatness or otherwise of your finished wash is going to deliberately vary depending on the effect you want to achieve. In this case, all I wanted to achieve was to make that detail stand out, so that's what I've done. Sometimes if you want a bit more dirtiness, you can sort of deliberately smudge things and streak things about, just to add some dirty effects. Just here again, just in between these areas, just clean up any little sort of smudges and nonsense if there is any. But because I added the wash in such a precise manner in the first place and then cleaned it off in an equally precise manner, there's really not too much cleanup to worry about here. Just the odd few little bits of smudging. And in fairness, none of that will be visible, actually, under the canopy anyway. There we go. That's all the wash added. And that now needs to be left to dry fully, so that that enamel wash is completely cured, and then we'll dry brush it. Alright then, now this is all dry. It's been left for a while. It's all completely dried, and that pin wash is now finished. Now I should point out, if you get to the point now where it's all dry and you look at it and you're not quite happy with it, if some of it's a bit smudgy or gappy, or some bits aren't quite as highly accentuated as you might want them to be, you can just do it again. You can continue to put extra layers of this wash on top. Some other washes you can't really do that because you'll wash away the preceding layers when you try to put fresh wash on. But with an enamel wash, as long as the layer underneath is completely dry, it will mostly stay there, and it shouldn't wash off. But yeah, you can put some more wash on if you're not happy with the effect. If you think you want it a bit more depth in there even than there is now, you can go ahead and put an extra layer on. So the opposite half of this pin washing step, so the pin wash has added some sort of fake depth, if you like. It's accentuated the depth of the detail. The other way to do that is actually to add a highlight, and we do that using dry brushing. So dry brushing, as the name suggests, is where you'll load up a brush with some form of paint, rub most of it off again until it's dry, and then using that brush accentuate the top of the detail. So the pin wash is collected around the base of all the details and in all the nooks and crannies, and the dry brush will do the exact opposite. It will just sit on the very tops and on the corners of things, and it will just give that little bit of a lift to go with the depth that we've added. The colour that you use really isn't terribly important. It just needs to be lighter than the paint colour. I mean, you can consider things like warmth and coolness of relative shades and things like that. You can use white, of course you can. Whites, very pale greys and very pale sort of buffs and beiges, I would say, are the obvious choice. I'm going to use today an oil brusher, and I'm going to use Sunny Flesh, a sort of pinkish pale. Oh, it is quite a good flesh colour actually, isn't it? Yeah, I'm going to use this. As I say, it's not very important what exact colour you use, because the idea is that you're not going to leave very much of it at all on this surface, so the exact shade isn't terrifically important. If I had something that was just a very pale sort of buff, something like this Deco Tan XF55 in an oil, then actually I'd probably use that, but this is about as close as I've got. Of course, you can mix paints together to achieve an exact shade. I could get some greens and add some paler colours to them. As to what paint you use, you can dry brush with any paint at all. But clearly the length of time that a paint remains open to manipulation is going to have a big effect on how successful dry brushing with it will be. Which is why, clear his throat, which is why oil paints are probably, broadly speaking, about the best thing to use. So oil brusher is simply a slightly pre-thinned form of oil paint. There's that precise applicator brush in action again. And I'm going to just dab a little bit of that on my paper towel here, and grab a brush. So this is my dry brushing brush. It's just an old brush. What is it? It's just a random number 2, and it's a square brush, which have I got any that aren't mucked up? This kind of thing. That's how it probably would have looked roughly before I started. You can buy specific brushes for dry brushing. Here is one, an Abteiling 502 dry brushing brush. I have tried it out. I can't perceive any real advantage over my old cheap random number 2 square-ended brush. Anyway, get some of that paint on the brush and see how I'm just scrubbing it around and generally being an absolute oaf. And then moving to another, this is really well lit as I'm looking at the screen, moving to a clean patch of the tissue. I've rubbed almost all of that paint back off again. So the bristles have just got the lightest trace of paint still on them. And then take your part, and literally pretty much just kind of polish in a way. You're really lightly just rubbing the brush across the raised detail. The effect is subtle. It should be subtle. If you can super easily see that something's been dry brushed, to be honest, you've failed. It should just be enough to just lift the detail, but not so much that you can literally physically see the edges and the sides of everything. So like that. You can see how just the top, everything just pops just that little bit more, because both the recesses have been artificially shadowed and deepened, and the lifted areas have been artificially highlighted. Take 2. So enshrine mental image of the before. Grab a bit more of this paint. Obviously putting it on the paper like this is leaching out the sort of oils to a degree, but that's fine. That actually helps us out as well. Make sure I'm in shot, and bear in mind that your black areas, the detail will pick itself out on them far more readily because it's a darker colour underneath, so just be a bit careful of that. And note that I'm going from various different directions because I want to pick up all of the edges basically. There we go. Again, can't necessarily straight away see, oh, dry brushing, but you can straight away see all that detail, all of that moulded in detail quite clearly. And that's really the whole point of dry brushing, is just to help us accentuate the moulded in detail that's already here. I'm just going to get a little bit more paint. I'll show you one last time on this cockpit floor. Oh, blob of colour. Hold this one up in the air a bit more, try it like that. I'm going to have to develop the skills of a surgeon here. No, I can't do it. I need to look at what I'm doing. Sorry. I'm hoping that you can barely even hear the sound of the brush touching the model, which just shows just how light of a touch you want when you're doing this. And again. There it is. I am going to dry brush also the black boxes, and this will be a bit more obvious, even though it's a tiny part, much easier to see. The effect that you get. Now what I've done here, quite deliberately, is I've put far too much on my brush, and I've then put far too much on the part. So when I bring this up close for you to see, can you see how you can just really see the dry brushing? That's what you don't really want. You could argue that it's still doing the job we want it to do, but the fact of it being so obvious, the fact that you can actually see the colour that's been used and all that, is just a clue that that's just probably a little bit too much. And if you find yourself in that position, good old cotton bud, a little touch of some kind of thinning media. You can use enamel thinners as I'm about to, or you could use turpentine. I've just got a little bit on my cotton bud, and I'm rolling off the excess on the tissue because I just want it damp. I don't want to flood the part with thinners. And just go back in with that, and you can just knock it off again. Go back to the beginning and start again, in the words of Horatio from CSI. Just like that. And when that thinners has dried, just go back in with the brush and just be a bit more careful. And there you go. That's dry brushing. So to finish off this episode, and to finish off the interior apart from its assembly, I'm going to put the instrument panel decal, and that's decal number 1 on the sheet here. So obviously I need to cut that decal out. Sometimes with instrument panels, in fact fairly frequently, I would say that it is prudent to trim the decal, use a scalpel or some such, to trim the decal quite closely to where the dials are actually printed, so that you don't have a load of clear decal film overhanging the edge of your panel. But this time, your decal's been designed very well. Trying to get that to reflect so that you can actually see, and I'm failing. Can't quite get it, but the carry film's very thin, but it's actually very tight to all of the dials as well, so there's no real need to worry too much about trimming that off. I've already got gloss coat on my instrument panel, not a lot, but definitely enough. And I have a jar that I have some water in. It's just water, there's nothing in it. And I just dip the decal and then pop it on there, so that's a non-porous surface. And leave that for a short while to soften. see if I can do this even a bit more zoomed in. There we go, there's my panel. I'm going to use Tamiya Mark Fit Strong as a decal solution for this. I know you can no longer see the decal. I have to wait for that to be movable. I always take away the numbers, take that off, get rid of it, because I don't want that to get in the way at any point. And just gently use the side of the tweezers so you don't poke holes in your decal. After a little while, give it a little poke and make sure it's moving. Once we know that the decal's moving and ready to be applied, take whatever solution you wish to use. As I said, I'm going to use Mark Fit Strong by Tamiya, and put some on the panel. Now I'm grabbing the decal with my tweezers, probably to gasps of horror from the crowd. And I'm going to just transfer it straight onto there, and then quickly and confidently manoeuvre it until it looks like it's in roughly the right place. It's very, very difficult to exactly see where that is. 100% of the time when you do this with a decal, it's really difficult to see exactly where the dials are underneath because of the moisture. And now, before I do anything else, I'm going to add more Mark Fit or more of your decal solution, whatever you're using, on top of the decal to get it to the point where it's completely flooded. Because we've got raised detail underneath the decal, there we go, I want it to be completely flooded. You can see I've not pushed it down into any of that detail, but you can also see that there are no air gaps at this point. That's deliberate. So taking a cotton bud, moisten it with water, or just stick it in your mouth, as long as it hasn't been anywhere nasty, like in the enamel thinners pot for example. And just try and, this one's not playing, it's moved. Okay, no worries, I'll just move it back. Just want to try and slowly, carefully encourage it to settle on top of that detail, you know, over and around it. And as you get the decal to start conforming, it will get easier gradually to touch the decal without the whole thing wanting to try and lift. Now I can see that that isn't softening and or wanting to conform, so I'm going to switch tacks. Instead of the Tamiya, I'm going to get out my Mr. Mark Softer, it's the Guns Deco Solution. Give it a shake. This stuff's fairly hardcore. Same again. Put a load on there so that it's fully wet again. Soak over and around and under the decal. Again, leave it for a moment to soften down. Now once you start using this, you need to be careful. Tamiya Mark Fit doesn't generally speaking, so far at least in my experience, I've been using it for a couple of years now, doesn't generally soften decals to the point of disintegration or just general destruction. Mr. Mark Softer absolutely will do precisely that if you're not extremely careful with it. So we still need to manipulate this decal. I see all the time people who put decals on, they stick a set under it, then they stick a soft over it, and then they say don't touch it, leave it alone. It doesn't work. You need to touch the decal, you just need to be careful. Same thing, I'm just going to very gently press it down, straight down. And I am being exceptionally gentle, barely touching it, because what I need to do essentially is push the water and solution out from underneath the decal. And in doing so, because the decal is now soft, it will conform to that detail and that relief. And there we have it. Great success. The instrument panel decal is now snugged down over all that detail. As you can see, does it line up? Probably not. It should be somewhere near. And that's it, leave it to dry. For advanced options at this point, you could apply a matte varnish to the entire panel and then pick out the dials themselves with a little bit of a gloss varnish on a tiny brush. Or you can just leave it exactly as it is. And there it is, that's the interior complete, as far as I'm going to go with this one anyway. So I've covered base coating it, clear coating it, pin wash, dry brush, decal, and then the assembly. Just follow the instructions. I did make a small change. I painted the control column black. In fairness to Airfix, it was noted as black on the instructions, I just declined to read it. Which is good because it is a tad over scale, and being black sort of decreases the impact of that a touch. Decal is as you saw it last. I haven't matte varnished it, I've left it alone. It's sunk down beautifully, no silvering, no mucking about, and that is it, ready to go together. So if I just pop that in there, pop that in there, there's what it looks like from the top. It's a very creditable rendition. It's simple, it's easy to work with, but it has a nice effect when you look at it assembled. And when you do this for yourselves with your models, you'll see how much more easy it is to see the detail. Try putting it together like this before you do your pin wash and dry brush, and then do it again afterwards, and see the difference in how easy it is to actually see. If I can ever get the light the right way around, to actually see any of that detail in there. It just does make a big difference. So that's it for this episode. In the next episode, we'll prepare the fuselage halves. There's a few bits need drilling and odds and sods to be done on that. So we'll prepare the fuselage halves, we'll fit this internal part, and we'll fit the fuselage together and deal with the seam. Thanks ever so much for watching as usual. Huge thanks to the people that are supporting the channel directly with Buy Me a Coffee and donos through YouTube actually, which are active as well. Thanks to the guys that are following on and keeping in touch and letting me know how they're doing. I'm absolutely loving that. Thank you so much to you guys. So until next time, it only remains for me to say, look after yourselves, look after each other, and Genesis out.